The sun had barely risen over the horizon when the small white plane lifted off from the island airstrip. The sky glowed orange and gold, the sea below calm and endless. Inside the cockpit, a man sat quietly, hands steady on the controls. He had been flying these island routes for years. To him, the air was home. He knew the sound of the engine like his own heartbeat and could read the clouds better than any map. That morning, everything felt ordinary. He was carrying boxes of medical supplies to a hospital on another island, something he did almost every week. The weather report had said clear skies all day. The air smelled of salt and heat, and the wind was soft and steady. He hummed a tune to himself as the plane glided over the wide blue ocean. Down below, the sea shimmered like glass. The waves near the reefs looked white and sharp from above. Every now and then he spotted a boat or a patch of coral, but mostly there was nothing, just water stretching to the horizon. Flying alone never bothered him. In fact, he liked the silence. It gave him time to think, to breathe. The islands were far apart, and sometimes he could go hours without seeing another plane or hearing a voice on the radio. It made him feel small in a way that was strangely comforting, but that day something changed. About halfway through the flight, just as he was passing over a narrow island chain, something caught his eye. It was faint at first, just a dark patch against the bright white sand. At first he thought it was driftwood, maybe a log washed ashore. That wasn't unusual. Storms often brought debris from the sea. He almost ignored it. But as he flew a little closer, something about the shape seemed strange. It wasn't rough or scattered like wood. It looked too even, too deliberate. He leaned forward, squinting through the glare of the sun on the windshield. The shape stood out clearly now, long and narrow, almost like letters or a sign. A small shiver went down his spine. He had seen many things from the sky: whales, dolphins, even old shipwrecks resting just beneath the water's surface. But this felt different. There was something human about it. He glanced at his fuel gauge and the clock. He was ahead of schedule. He could afford a short detour. He banked the plane gently to the left and descended a little. The engine's hum deepened as he brought the plane lower, closer to the island. From this distance, he could see the beach clearly now. The sand was pale gold, untouched except for that one strange mark. He steadied his breathing as he flew past it. Then he saw it. It wasn't a shadow or driftwood at all. It was a word made from dark stones carefully arranged on the sand. He read it in an instant. Help. His heart jumped. He turned the plane in a slow circle, flying over it again to make sure he wasn't imagining things. No, it was real. Someone had spelled it out big enough to be seen from the sky. The stones were laid in neat lines, each letter stretching several feet long. He felt his pulse quicken. Someone must be stranded there. He looked around the beach for any sign of movement. There were palm trees at the edge, their leaves swaying in the light wind. A small pile of debris sat near the tree line, maybe wood or old fabric. But he saw no people. The island looked silent and empty. He called on his radio, reporting the coordinates to the nearest base, but the signal crackled weakly. This area often had poor communication. He tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. Only static. He leaned back in his seat, thinking fast. He couldn't just ignore it. If someone was alive down there, they might not survive much longer. The island wasn't marked as inhabited on his maps. It was probably one of the many small ones left untouched for decades. He checked his instruments again. Enough fuel to make a landing and still reach the next island. It was a risk. Landing on an unknown strip of sand could be dangerous. But he couldn't fly away knowing someone might be down there waiting for help. He circled once more, looking for a flat, clear stretch of land. On the northern edge of the island, there was a smooth patch of sand between the palm trees and the sea. It wasn't ideal, but it was his best chance. He took a deep breath, adjusted the controls, and began his descent. The engine roared louder as the plane dropped lower. The wind pushed against the wings, and the wheels brushed the air before touching down with a rough thump. The sand dragged under the tires, slowing the plane quickly. He gripped the controls tightly until the plane came to a stop. The engine sputtered, then quieted to a soft hum. For a moment, everything was still. The sound of the ocean filled the silence. He could hear his own breathing, quick and uneven. He opened the door and climbed out. The hot air hit him instantly, thick and salty. The sun was blazing overhead. He walked a few steps into the sand, his boots sinking with each move. The island was beautiful, wild and untouched. but there was something eerie about how quiet it was. He turned toward the beach where he had seen the message. From here, it was only a few 100 meters away. The word "help" stood out clearly, the stones dark against the pale sand. He started walking toward it, shielding his eyes from the sun. Each step seemed heavier. He could feel the heat burning his skin and sweat trickled down his neck. The sound of waves crashing nearby felt louder now, almost echoing. When he reached the edge of the message, he knelt down and touched one of the stones. It was smooth and warm. They had clearly been carried from somewhere else, maybe from near the tree line. Whoever made this must have spent hours under the sun arranging them. He stood up and looked around again. The island stretched wide on both sides, covered in tall grass and scattered palm trees. He called out, his voice echoing faintly in the open air. "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. Only the waves and the whisper of wind through the trees. He tried again, louder. "Is anyone here? I saw your sign." Still nothing. A flock of birds flew up from the trees in the distance, startled by his voice. He frowned, feeling a strange mix of worry and curiosity. Someone had clearly been here. Maybe they were hiding. Maybe they were too weak to respond. Or maybe it was an old sign, a leftover from someone long gone. He didn't want to believe that. He walked further up the beach, scanning the ground for footprints or signs of a camp. Then he saw something, faint impressions in the sand leading toward the trees. They were human footprints, uneven and shallow, but fresh enough that the tide hadn't erased them. He followed them slowly, his senses sharp. The trees grew thicker as he entered the shade, and the air became cooler. The smell of damp leaves and salt filled the air. He kept walking, calling out softly now. A rustling sound came from deeper in the trees. He froze. It could have been an animal. There were wild pigs and birds on some of these islands. But it could also be the person who made the signal. He waited, listening. The rustling stopped. The forest went silent again. He took a step forward, careful not to make noise. His heart pounded in his chest. The shadows between the trees moved with the wind, making it hard to tell what was real. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of something, a flash of color, maybe fabric hanging from a low branch. He walked closer and saw it clearly now, a piece of cloth faded and torn, tied around a stick. It looked like it had once been bright red, a makeshift flag. He reached out and touched it. The fabric was stiff with salt, but still held together. It was clear now, and someone had lived here, maybe recently. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest floor. There were more signs, a small pile of shells, a few broken coconuts, what looked like the remains of a fire pit. He crouched down beside it. The ashes were gray but still visible. It hadn't been that long since it burned. Whoever had made that fire might still be nearby. He stood again and looked deeper into the trees. The path of footprints continued into the shadows. He felt a strange pull, curiosity mixed with worry, and took a slow step forward. As he walked, the sound of waves faded behind him. The forest grew darker and thicker, vines hanging low and insects buzzing all around. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Every sense was alert. He called out one last time, "Hey, I'm here to help." For a few seconds there was only silence. Then faintly from somewhere up ahead came a sound. It was soft, almost like a cough. He froze again, listening carefully. It came again, weak but real. Someone was there. He took a deep breath and began walking faster toward the sound, brushing aside branches as he went. The air grew still, heavy with tension. He didn't know who he was about to find, but one thing was certain. This was no accident. That message on the beach had been real, and someone had been waiting a long time for this moment. The sound came again, faint but real. It was a weak cough, followed by a rustling of leaves. He moved carefully through the undergrowth, calling out softly so he wouldn't startle whoever was there. The trees thinned a little ahead and sunlight broke through in patches on the ground. Then he saw him. A man sat slumped against a tree trunk, half in the shade, half in the sun. His clothes were torn and faded, his skin darkened by the sun. He looked thin, his face hollow and his hair messy, like it hadn't been cut or washed in months. When the pilot stepped closer, the man flinched slightly, raising a trembling hand to shield his eyes. "It's okay," the pilot said quietly, keeping his voice calm. "I saw your signal on the beach. I'm here to help." The man blinked a few times as if trying to believe what he was hearing. His lips moved, but at first no sound came out. Then in a cracked, weak voice he whispered, "You saw it?" "I did," the pilot said, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now. I have a plane on the beach. We can get you out of here." The man stared for a moment, eyes wide with disbelief. Then his body began to shake, not from fear, but from exhaustion and relief. A single tear rolled down his cheek, leaving a clean line through the dirt on his skin. "I thought," he started, then stopped, his voice breaking. "I thought nobody would ever see it." The pilot opened his small emergency pack and took out a bottle of water. He unscrewed the cap and held it out. The man reached for it with trembling hands, drinking greedily but carefully. When he finished, he leaned back, breathing deeply, eyes closed as if trying to hold on to the moment. "Thank you," he whispered, voice barely audible. The pilot nodded, scanning him quickly. His clothes were ripped, but he didn't seem seriously injured and just weak and sunburned. There were small scratches on his arms and legs, probably from moving through the brush. "How long have you been here?" the pilot asked gently. The man's eyes flicked open. "I don't know anymore," he said slowly. "Months, maybe. I stopped counting after a while." He took a shaky breath and pointed toward the sea. "My boat went down in a storm. It was supposed to be a short trip. I thought I could make it to the next island, but the wind changed. I lost control." His voice was hoarse, each word costing effort. The pilot listened quietly, not interrupting. "There were 3 of us," the man continued after a pause. "The others didn't make it. The waves, they were too strong." His voice trembled. "I washed up here the next morning. No food, no water, nothing." He looked down at the ground, his hand tightening around the empty bottle. "At first I thought someone would find me in a few days. I made that sign on the beach as soon as I could. Every day I checked the sky. Planes passed sometimes, but they were too high, too far. Then, after a while, I stopped believing anyone would see it." The pilot's throat tightened. He'd seen plenty of lonely places in his years of flying, but hearing those words made the silence of the island feel heavier. "You're lucky I flew this way today," he said quietly. "That sign had saved you," the man smiled weakly. "I almost gave up on it. I thought it didn't matter anymore." The pilot helped him stand. His legs shook under his weight, so he let the man lean on his shoulder as they started walking back toward the beach. The path was uneven, but they moved slowly and steadily. The forest was quiet except for the soft sound of leaves brushing against them and the distant murmur of the waves. As they walked, the man spoke again, his voice stronger now that he'd had water. "What day is it?" The pilot hesitated for a moment, doing the math in his head. "It's late April," he said finally. The man stopped walking for a second, staring at him. "April?" he repeated, almost whispering. "That means I've been here more than 5 months." He shook his head slowly, eyes wide in disbelief. 5 months, he murmured again, almost to himself. The pilot didn't know what to say. He just nodded and kept walking. He knew that kind of realization, when time suddenly comes back to you after being lost, could hit harder than hunger or thirst. When they reached the beach again, the plane stood gleaming in the sunlight, its white body bright against the golden sand. The word "help" still stretched beside it, silent proof of the man's fight to survive. The pilot helped him sit near the plane and opened another pack, offering a protein bar. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the best meal he'd ever had. "Do you have any idea where we are?" the man asked after a few minutes. "Not exactly," the pilot said, checking his small map and GPS. "Somewhere about 70 miles from the nearest inhabited island. You're lucky, most planes don't pass this route. I was only here because of a delivery change." The man gave a soft laugh, the sound dry and tired. "Then I guess fate wanted me to live." "Maybe so," the pilot said with a faint smile. They sat in silence for a few moments, the sound of the sea filling the space between them. Seagulls flew overhead, their cries sharp and distant. The pilot could see how the man kept glancing around and at the sky, the ocean, the trees, as if still trying to believe this was real. "Eventually," the man said quietly, "I thought a lot about people while I was here. You start to remember every little thing, like the smell of coffee in the morning, voices, the sound of cars, laughter. Things you think are normal. When it's all gone, you realize how much life you've been missing." The pilot listened silently. He knew that feeling in a smaller way. Flying alone for long hours gave him time to think about life too, the things people take for granted when the world feels safe. "We'll get you home," the pilot said finally, standing up. "But we have to go soon. The tide's coming in." I don't want the landing strip underwater when we take off. The man nodded, his eyes full of tired gratitude. The pilot helped him climb into the small plane and secured him in the co-pilot seat. He made sure the man had another bottle of water and adjusted the seatbelt carefully. Before starting the engine, he looked out the window one last time. The island lay silent and still, the message on the beach standing as a reminder of what had happened there. It felt wrong to leave it, yet right at the same time. He turned the key and the engine sputtered to life. The sound seemed to fill the air, echoing against the quiet beach. The man looked out the window, his expression a mix of relief and sadness. The pilot eased the plane forward, the wheels bumping softly over the sand. The ocean waves were creeping closer, but there was still enough room to take off. He increased the throttle, feeling the vibration build beneath his hands. The plane picked up speed, and with one smooth pull it lifted off the ground. As they climbed higher, the island grew smaller below them. The man stared out the window, watching the spot where he'd spent so many lonely days disappear beneath the clouds. He whispered something under his breath. Maybe a goodbye, maybe a thank you after a few minutes. The pilot glanced over and saw that the man had closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he looked peaceful. The flight back was quiet. The pilot checked his instruments often, making sure everything was steady. The sky was beginning to darken slightly in the distance, the faint edges of a storm building somewhere far away. He adjusted his route to stay clear of it. Halfway through the flight, the man opened his eyes again and turned toward him. "Do you ever think about how small we are?" he asked softly. The pilot smiled faintly. "All the time," he said. "Especially up here." The man nodded. "When I was on that island, I used to look at the stars. I'd think about everyone out there living their lives and how easy it is to disappear. I promised myself that if I ever got out, I'd never take another day for granted." "That's a good promise," the pilot said. They flew in silence for a while after that. The sound of the engine was steady and the sky ahead was clear. When the coastline of the next island appeared on the horizon, the man's eyes filled with tears again. He pressed his forehead against the window, whispering softly, "I never thought I'd see this again." The pilot said nothing. He just focused on the descent, the runway coming into view. When the wheels finally touched down, the man let out a shaky breath, almost a laugh, almost a cry. They rolled to a stop, and for the first time in months, the man was safe. As ground crew ran toward the plane, the pilot looked over at him. The man met his gaze and smiled weakly. "You were meant to see me," he said quietly. The pilot didn't answer. He just nodded. Deep down, he knew it was true. Sometimes life had a way of putting you in the right place at the right time. No explanations, no logic, just a small act that changes everything. And on that quiet beach, one word written in stones had been enough to bring two lives together. One desperate for rescue, and one willing to listen to a small feeling that told him to look twice. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. The air smelled faintly of salt and antiseptic. Outside, waves crashed softly against the shore, a reminder that even here the ocean wasn't far away. The rescued man lay in a clean bed, his face calmer now, though the weight of months of isolation still lingered in his eyes. For the first time in months, he wasn't hungry, cold, or afraid. But his mind hadn't yet caught up with his body. Every sound, a door closing, a distant voice, made him flinch a little, as if afraid it would all disappear and he'd wake up back on that lonely island. The pilot had stayed at the hospital longer than he'd planned. He didn't know the man well, but after everything that happened, it didn't feel right to just drop him off and walk away. He sat by the window, hands folded, watching as sunlight spilled into the room. A nurse came in and smiled warmly. "He's lucky you found him," she said softly as she adjusted the IV line. "The doctors said another week out there and he might not have made it." The pilot nodded slowly. "He was strong to hold on that long," he said. The nurse smiled again before leaving, closing the door quietly behind her. The man stirred in his bed and opened his eyes. When he saw the pilot sitting there, he gave a faint smile. "You're still here," he said, his voice weak but steadier than before. "Didn't want to leave without making sure you were okay," the pilot said. The man looked around the room, his eyes settling on the window. "It's strange," he said softly. "I used to dream about a bed, roof. A glass of water that didn't taste like salt. Now that I have all that, it doesn't feel real. It'll take time, the pilot said gently. You've been through a lot. The man nodded slowly. You know, I used to work on boats my whole life, he began after a pause. I knew the sea better than land. But when that storm hit, it felt like the ocean turned against me. I'd been in rough weather before, but this was different. The wind came out of nowhere. The waves were taller than I'd ever seen. He stared at his hands as he spoke, his voice low. I tried to keep the boat steady. My 2 friends were with me. Good men, both of them. We thought it would pass in an hour. But it just got worse. The radio died, the compass broke, and before we knew it, we were being thrown around like toys. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling now. When the boat started to split, we jumped. The waves pulled us apart. I kept calling their names, but I couldn't hear anything over the storm. I don't even know how I made it to the island. I woke up on the sand alone. The room went silent for a few moments. The pilot didn't try to fill the silence. He just listened, his expression soft. I searched the shoreline for days, the man continued. Found pieces of the boat, but never found them. After a week, I stopped expecting to. I started thinking I'd die there too. He paused, his eyes distant. I remember the first night clearly. The sound of the waves, the cold wind, the darkness. I'd never felt fear like that before. He took a deep breath. Then I decided I couldn't just wait. I started building that sign. It gave me something to do, something to hope for. Every day I'd check the sky. Sometimes I'd see a plane, just a dot far away. I'd wave, shout, anything, but they never saw me. The pilot looked down, his jaw tight. I almost didn't see it either, he said quietly. I passed over once, thought it was driftwood. Something told me to look again. The man smiled faintly. Guess that something saved my life. Maybe, the pilot said. Or maybe you saved your own by not giving up. The man's smile widened a little, though his eyes glistened. Funny thing is, he said, after the first month I stopped building the sign. I thought no one would ever see it. Then one day I walked down to the beach and thought, what if someone does? So I rebuilt it, bigger, clearer. That was only a week before you showed up. He paused, wiping a tear that had formed at the corner of his eye. I think about that a lot. How one small decision can change everything. The pilot nodded. Yeah, he said softly. One small choice. They sat in silence again, the sounds of the hospital faint in the background. The man looked out the window, watching the palm trees sway gently in the breeze. When you're out there alone, he said after a while, you start to see life differently. You stop caring about the things that don't matter. You think about people you love, things you wish you'd said, moments you took for granted. It's like the world goes quiet, and all that's left is truth. The pilot understood that more than he expected to. Flying alone over the ocean day after day, he often thought about the same things. How small humans were, how fragile and how easily they could be lost. Later that afternoon, a doctor came in to check on the patient. After a brief conversation, he told the pilot the man would need a few more days of rest before being moved to a larger hospital on the mainland. The pilot nodded and promised to visit again before leaving. When he stood up to go, the man reached out a weak hand. Thank you, he said quietly. You didn't just save my life. You gave me a second chance. The pilot hesitated, then took his hand firmly. You don't owe me anything, he said. Just make it count. The man nodded, his eyes filling again. I will. The pilot left the hospital, stepping into the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of sea breeze and flowers, the kind of scent that reminded him how alive the world could be. But something inside him had changed. For the next few days, he kept flying his usual routes. But he couldn't stop thinking about that island, the message on the beach, the footprints in the sand, the quiet desperation that had turned into hope. Every time he looked down at the ocean, he found himself scanning the beaches again just in case. Meanwhile, the man began to regain strength. He ate slowly at first, spoke with the nurses, and started walking around the room. Each day he looked more alive, but even as his body healed, his mind carried the memories of isolation. He often woke in the middle of the night disoriented, thinking he was still on the island. Then he'd hear the hum of machines, see the soft light of the hospital room, and remember he was safe. One morning the pilot came back to visit. The man was sitting by the window this time, watching the sunrise. When he turned and saw the pilot, he smiled warmly. I was just thinking about you, he said. Good thoughts, I hope, the pilot said, smiling. The man chuckled softly. The best kind. I was thinking about how strange it is that two people's paths can cross in the middle of nowhere. Life's funny that way, the pilot said, sitting down. Sometimes the smallest things change everything. The man nodded slowly. When I was on that island, I kept telling myself stories to stay sane. I'd imagine someone finding me, what I'd say, what it would feel like. But nothing I imagined came close to the real thing. The real thing was quieter, softer. It felt like peace. He turned to look at the pilot. I think you were meant to be there that day. The pilot smiled faintly but didn't answer. They talked for a while longer, about flying, the sea, the things they'd both seen. Before leaving, the pilot said, I'll come back before you go to the mainland. I'll hold you to that, the man said with a grin. When the pilot returned a few days later, the man was standing outside the hospital for the first time, leaning on a walking stick. His face had color again, his posture stronger. The two men stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the ocean that stretched endlessly before them. It's strange, the man said softly. I used to think of the ocean as my enemy. Now I see it differently. It's not cruel, it's just powerful. It gives and takes. It tests you, but in a way it also teaches you what life really means. The pilot nodded, watching the waves crash in the distance. It's the same from up there, he said, pointing toward the sky. When you're flying, it feels endless. You realize how small we are and how lucky we are to be part of it. The man smiled. You ever think about how we're all just trying to be seen? Just like that sign on the beach. We all want someone to notice we're here. The pilot looked at him for a long moment and then said quietly, Yeah, I think we all do. The two men stood there, the sea wind brushing against their faces, both silently grateful, one for being saved, and the other for having seen what others might have missed. Neither of them knew it yet, but their story was about to travel far beyond those waves. What started as a quiet rescue would soon touch people around the world. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest glance from above can change a life forever. The days after the flight passed in a blur. The pilot couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The rescue, the storm, and the moment the man finally stepped back into the world after months of isolation. It all stayed in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. He tried to go back to his regular routine, flying short cargo trips between islands, but things didn't feel the same. Every time he looked out of the cockpit window, he found himself scanning the beaches and shorelines below, as if expecting to see another message written in the sand. It had become a habit now, a quiet reminder that sometimes, even from miles above, you can change someone's fate. One morning, about 2 weeks after the rescue, he received a call from the hospital on the mainland. The man he'd saved wanted to meet him again before heading home. Without hesitation, the pilot agreed. He cleared his schedule, refueled his small aircraft, and took off that afternoon. The flight felt peaceful. The weather was calm, the sun bright, and the clouds soft like cotton. It was as if the sky itself wanted to make this final trip smooth. When he landed near the coastal hospital, he found the man waiting outside with a smile that looked lighter, freer. He was walking more steadily now, his face healthier, his eyes full of gratitude. When he saw the pilot step out of the plane, he waved and walked forward. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, he said with a grin. But I'm glad I was wrong. The pilot smiled back. You look good, he said. Better than last time I saw you, the man laughed softly. Food and sleep can do miracles. Then his tone turned serious. I wanted to see you before I go home. There's something I need to tell you. They found a quiet spot overlooking the water near the small airfield. The sea breeze carried the faint sound of waves and the air smelled like salt and wildflowers. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the man took a deep breath. You know, when I was stuck on that island, he began slowly, I kept thinking about how I might never be found. The world felt so far away. Every day I woke up hoping to hear a plane, any plane. But after a while, even hope felt like a cruel joke. The pilot listened silently, eyes steady. Then one day, the man continued, I saw your plane. Just a speck at first. I jumped up, waving my arms like a madman, but you kept flying. My heart sank. I thought that was it, after my last chance gone. But then, you came back. He paused, his voice catching slightly. That moment, when you turned back, it felt like the whole world noticed me again. You don't know what that means to someone who's been forgotten. The pilot looked down for a second, feeling the weight of his words. I almost didn't go back, he admitted quietly. I thought it was just driftwood at first. But something told me to look again. The man smiled faintly. Whatever that something was, I owe it my life. They sat there in silence for a while, listening to the waves. Then the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. A smooth, flat stone with faded letters carved into it. It was one of the stones from the message he had written on the beach. I brought this with me, he said softly. A reminder. I used to look at it every day to keep myself sane. Now I want you to have it. The pilot hesitated. You sure? The man nodded. Yes, it belongs to both of us now. The pilot took the stone carefully, running his fingers over the rough edges. The letters were barely visible, but he could still make out part of the word help. He closed his hand around it. Thank you, he said simply. Later that day, the two went to a nearby cafe by the harbor. They sat by the window drinking coffee, watching fishing boats glide by. The conversation flowed easily now. Stories of family, childhood memories, dreams for the future. The man talked about how his family had searched for him for months before giving up hope. They had held a small memorial service, thinking he was gone forever. When the rescue news reached them, they couldn't believe it. His wife fainted, his parents cried, and even the neighbors came to their house to celebrate. They said it was like a ghost had come back to life, he said with a laugh. The pilot smiled. They must be counting the minutes until you're home. They are, the man said softly. And I can't wait to see them. But before I leave, I wanted to make sure you knew what you did. You didn't just save a person. You saved everything that person loved. Those words hit deeply. The pilot didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. That evening, they walked down to the beach near the town. The sun was setting, painting the water orange and gold. The man stopped and looked at the horizon. You ever think about how small we are, he said. And yet somehow our choices can still reach across miles and change someone's world. The pilot looked out too. Yeah, he said quietly. Maybe that's the best part of being human. The man smiled. I think so too. A few days later, the man finally left for his hometown. His family met him at the airport, and the reunion was everything he had dreamed of. Tears, laughter, and long hugs that said more than words ever could. News of his survival spread quickly. Reporters came to hear the story, calling it the miracle rescue. Photos of the island, the message on the sand, and the small rescue plane filled newspapers and social media. But through all the attention, both men stayed humble. When asked about it, the pilot simply said, I was just doing what felt right. And the man always replied, he saw me when no one else did. That's all that matters. Soon after, a documentary team reached out to tell their story properly. The pilot hesitated at first. He wasn't someone who liked the spotlight. But when he learned that part of the proceeds would go to funding better island search and rescue equipment, he agreed. When filming began, they returned together to the island. The beach was quiet again, the stones scattered by wind and tide. But standing there brought everything back. The fear, the hope, the moment that changed two lives forever. The man walked to where his message had once been and knelt, touching the sand gently. This place gave me a second chance, he said softly. The pilot stood beside him. And it gave me purpose, he replied. They smiled at each other. After the film released, people around the world were touched by their story. Letters and messages poured in, from families who had lost loved ones at sea, from pilots who said the story reminded them to always look twice, from ordinary people who said it gave them hope when they needed it most. One message stood out. It came from a young boy who had seen the film with his parents. He wrote, I want to be a pilot when I grow up so I can help people too. The pilot kept that note pinned to his office wall. Every time he read it, it made him smile. Months passed, but the two men stayed in touch. They called each other often, sometimes just to talk about simple things, the weather, fishing, family. Sometimes silence filled the line, but it was a comfortable kind of silence, the kind that exists only between people who shared something that can't be explained. One morning, about a year after the rescue, the pilot received a postcard. It showed a picture of a quiet countryside with green fields and a lake. On the back, the man had written, Life is peaceful now. Every sunrise feels like a gift. Thank you for giving me the chance to see it again. The pilot placed the postcard beside the stone on his desk. Every time he looked at them, he remembered that day. The bright sky, the strange shape on the sand, and the feeling in his gut that told him to turn back. He knew he'd never forget it. Not because of the attention or the praise, but because of what it meant, that one small choice. One extra glance had brought someone home. Years later, when the pilot was older and had flown hundreds more flights, people still asked him about that rescue. He always told the same story in the same quiet way with the same small smile, and he always ended it with the same line. Sometimes, all it takes is one person looking in the right direction at the right moment. And then he would pause, look out the window toward the endless sky, and add softly, "That's where miracles begin."